The Comoro Islands, a tropical paradise that smells of ylang-ylang and expensive cognac. But in 1978, it smelled of gunpowder and betrayal. The CIA needed a tool to stop Soviet submarines from hunting Western tankers, but they couldn't send the Marines. Instead, they sent a man with 5 different passports and a private army. This is the story of Bob Denard and the Mercenary Archipelago, where a single unsigned check could buy a nation, and where the Cold War was fought in the shadows of coral reefs. It was an era of proxy wars, when superpowers preferred not to bloody their hands with direct intervention. Why send a carrier strike group when you can send a single fishing trawler with 50 professionals carrying passports from 5 different countries and nothing in their heads but cold calculation and the clink of Swiss francs? The strategy of containment in this region evolved into a graceful yet bloody ballet. Washington understood. If the Comoros or the Seychelles turned permanently red, Soviet Project 641 diesel submarines would have the perfect base to hunt Western supertankers. Langley needed a tool, sharp, efficient, and, most importantly, completely deniable. That tool was the Mercenary King, the last Corsair of the 20th century, a man for whom coups were not a crime, but a craft. Welcome to the Mercenary Archipelago. Here, the air tastes of ylang-ylang, expensive cognac in colonial mansions, and cheap gunpowder in the night jungles. Here, betrayal is merely a form of business, and loyalty is bought with a monthly unsigned check. Chapter 1. The Spectre of the Red Beacon. Moroni, Grande Comore, August 1975. The heat in the Comoros is not just felt on the skin. It presses down like a heavy, wet wool blanket. The air is thick with the cloying, almost sickly scent of ylang-ylang blossoms, mingled with the sharp stench of rotting seaweed and cheap diesel fuel from the harbor. In President Ali Soili's office, the air conditioner had stopped working. The old French unit had finally given up, leaving behind only a strained hum and beads of condensation on the wallpaper. Soili, a man with the burning eyes of a fanatic and the mannerisms of a disillusioned intellectual, lit a filterless cigarette of a local brand. The smoke was acrid and gray. He had just proclaimed a socialist revolution in a country where half the population couldn't read, and the other half believed in djinns more than in Marx. "We will tear these islands from the claws of the colonial past," he muttered to his adjutant, staring at a yellowed map of the archipelago. "Even if we have to burn that past to the ground." Soili began a cultural revolution, Comorian style. He disbanded the gendarmerie, replacing them with the pioneers, teenagers in worn tunics, armed with Chinese Type 56 assault rifles. He banned traditional grand mariage weddings, confiscated land from the old aristocracy, and, most dangerously, began flirting with Moscow. At CIA headquarters in Langley, the situation was viewed through the lens of dry analytics. Satellite imagery sat on the analysts' desks. Soviet Okean-class intelligence ships were appearing with increasing frequency in the channel between Madagascar and Africa. Ali Soili wasn't just building socialism, he was creating a breach in the West's cordon sanitaire. "He's insane," the handler stated, a tall man in a flawless tropical wool suit sitting in a private club in Paris. "He's burning national archives because they are symbols of colonialism. He has no money, but he has strategic positioning. We cannot allow the Comoros to become a second Aden." His counterpart, a representative of the French DGSE, slowly stirred his espresso. A silent pact existed between Paris and Washington. Africa was a French garden, but if the fence fell, America provided the money for a new one. "Direct intervention is out of the question," the Frenchman said. "The Élysée Palace doesn't want headlines about neo-colonialism. We need someone from the outside, a private citizen, filthy but effective." "Do you have candidates?" the handler asked, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "There is one man. He is in Gabon right now. Name's Bob Denard. They call him Le Vieux. the old man. He fought in the Congo, in Biafra, in Yemen. He isn't just a mercenary, he's a political animal. Meanwhile, in Moroni, Soily continued his descent into the abyss. His youth guard patrolled the streets in battered Land Rover jeeps, intimidating merchants and hunting for enemies of the people. The country was running out of rice and discontent was festering. But Soily believed in his mission. He ordered the destruction of all legal records accumulated during years of French rule, declaring that from now on, justice would be administered by conscience. It was a classic prelude to catastrophe. The island's economy, tied to the export of vanilla and cloves, collapsed within months. France cut off financial aid, and the treasury lacked even the francs to pay civil servants' salaries. In a small bar in Libreville, where a ceiling fan lazily chased flies above the counter, Bob Denard read a brief dispatch. In his eyes, accustomed to squinting against the Saharan sun and the humidity of the Katanga jungles, a spark of interest flickered. Denard didn't look like a Hollywood action hero. Trim, with a neat mustache and the gaze of a university professor, he preferred fine cognac and classical music. But behind this facade was a man who, for $10,000, could topple a government, and for $50, could redraw the map of a region. "The Comoros?" he asked the contact. "Is that the place with many flowers and few bullets?" "The money will be sufficient, Bob. Washington wants Soily gone. But officially, they aren't there. We aren't there either. You are just a private investor in security." Denard smirked, stroking the grip of his favorite Browning high power. "A private investor. I like the term. Tell our friends in Paris and Langley. I'll need a vessel, 50 proven men, and total non-interference from their fleets in the sector." Operation Atlantis began to take shape. While Ali Soily delivered fiery speeches in his palace about the coming triumph of the proletariat, men with distinct military bearings and no questions began to gather in the ports of France and Gabon. The air smelled not only of ilang ilang, but of impending blood. For the CIA, it was the perfect black project. If Denard won, a pro-Soviet regime would fall. If he failed, Washington would simply shrug and call him an uncontrollable adventurer. No diplomatic notes, no protests at the UN, just business, Cold War style. Soily did not yet know that his fate had already been paid for by a check in a Parisian bank, and that his cultural revolution was about to collide with the cold steel of European mercenaries. A long, stifling night was falling over the archipelago, and out of that darkness, a ship was already emerging, one that would change the history of the Islands of the Moon forever. Chapter 2. A Trawler for the Dogs of War. Brittany, France, Gulf of Guinea, March 1978. In the port of Lorient, where gray Atlantic waves crash against concrete piers with a thunderous roar, the fishing trawler Antonia looked utterly mundane. An old tub with peeling paint on its hull and the thick stench of burnt diesel and salty scales. For decades, Breton fishermen had taken such vessels out to sea for cod. Not a single port gendarme took notice of the group of men boarding at night, carrying heavy canvas military duffel bags instead of fishing gear. Bob Denard stood on the bridge, smoking a strong, filterless Gauloise. The blue smoke mingled with the cold Brittany fog. In his pocket lay a stack of bank checks, laundered through shell companies in Geneva and Libreville. Money the CIA had funneled through French intelligence accounts. 5 million francs for a private expedition. "The crew is assembled, Bob," a sub-commander whispered, approaching him. He was a veteran of Indochina with a deep scar running down his neck. 52 men, all affreux, the dreadful ones. Former legionnaires, paratroopers, a few Belgians from the Congo. Not a single rookie among them. Denard nodded. His army was tiny, but each of these men was worth a battalion of Soily's conscripts. They knew how to handle French MAS-49 rifles and Belgian FALs. In the hold, beneath layers of crushed ice and crates of salt, rested not nets, but brand new MAT-49 submachine guns, grenade launchers, and crates of 7.62 millimeter ammunition. The Antonea cleared the port at dawn. Official course? Fishing grounds off the coast of South Africa. Real objective? The seizure of an entire sovereign state in the Indian Ocean. The voyage took 3 weeks. It was a time of grueling routine and covert preparation. In the narrow corridors of the trawler, where the walls sweated from humidity, the mercenaries cleaned their weapons and studied maps of Grand Comoro, printed by the DGSE's topographical department. Denard established iron discipline: no alcohol, daily calisthenics on the slippery deck, and endless briefings. "We don't need a frontal assault," Denard explained to his group leaders, spreading a map across the mess hall table. "Soily is a paranoid. His pioneers patrol the coast, but they are children with rifles. We strike at the heart, the presidential residence in Moroni, at night, quietly." The handler from Langley, then stationed in Paris, received brief encrypted reports via the station in Libreville. Operation Atlantis was on schedule. For Washington, it was the perfect black op model. If Denard seized the islands, the U.S. gained a strategic vantage point to monitor the Soviet squadron in the Indian Ocean. If the Antonea went to the bottom, the White House would simply state it bore no responsibility for the actions of a band of retired adventurers. South of the equator, the heat became unbearable. The metal of the deck grew so hot it burned through the soles of their boots. The mercenaries changed into light camouflage trousers and undershirts, their skin becoming encrusted with salt and tan. In the Gulf of Guinea, the ship refueled from a tanker owned by a South African shell company, another player in this cynical alliance. Pretoria was equally interested in toppling the Marxists in the Comoros to create a waypoint for bypassing international sanctions. Denard spent hours in his cabin, reading the dossier on Ali Soily. He understood his opponent. Soily was an intellectual who had decided to play God. His cultural revolution had turned the Paradise Islands into an open-air concentration camp. The Comorians, exhausted by hunger and the terror of adolescent fanatics, were waiting for anyone, even the devil, if only he brought bread and order. He made the classic dictator's mistake, Denard told his deputy as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope. He believed the people loved him, but the people are simply afraid. When the fear vanishes, he will be left alone. In mid-May, the Antonea entered the Mozambique Channel. To avoid detection by coastal radars, which, in Soily's case, worked only fitfully, the trawler ran dark, hugging the coastline with its lights extinguished. May 28, 1978. The sea was as calm as a mirror. A massive moon hung in the sky, flooding the ocean with a ghostly silver light. Denard ordered the Zodiac inflatable boats to be lowered. On the deck of the trawler, the mercenaries applied black grease paint to their faces. The silence was broken only by the faint, metallic clatter of bolts and whispered orders. Every man knew his place. Group Alpha, seizure of the presidential palace. Group Bravo, neutralizing the pioneer barracks. Group Charlie, control of the radio station. Lads, Denard stepped forward, dressed in a black jumpsuit with a Browning on his hip. Tomorrow, we breakfast in Moroni, or we don't breakfast at all. Remember, we are not the Army of France. We are a private enterprise. Work clean, work fast, and keep it quiet. Soily must be taken alive, if possible. The boats slipped into the water. The powerful Evinrude motors were muffled with rags to dampen the sound. The Antonea stayed behind, dissolving into the midnight mist. Ahead, beyond the coral reefs, the sparse lights of Moroni flickered. It was a classic proxy war in miniature, 50 men against an entire regime. Langley's cynical wager against Moscow's ambitions. The outcome of the game was being decided in the silence of the tropical night, under the steady dip of oars and the scent of an approaching storm. Denard stood at the bow of the lead boat, staring at the dark silhouette of Mount Carthala. He was returning to the islands he considered his personal fiefdom. Atlantis was breaking the surface. Chapter 3. Night of the Long Knives in Moroni, Grande Comore, May 29, 1978, 2:45 a.m. The black water of the Indian Ocean lapped lazily against the sides of the Zodiacs. Denard's mercenaries covered the final 500 meters on oars to avoid alerting anyone with the roar of the engines. The air was thick, almost tactile, with the scent of rotting fruit and diesel drifting from the port. The city slept a heavy, hungry sleep. Electricity in Moroni was intermittent, and only a few dim lanterns near the waterfront pierced the tropical gloom. Denard was the first to leap into the shallows. The warm, salty water reached his waist. His team, 12 men in black jumpsuits, armed with suppressed Sterling L-34A1 submachine guns and the faithful MAT-49s, moved toward the presidential palace. "Group Bravo, report," Denard whispered into his portable Motorola radio. "In position at the barracks. The pioneers are asleep. Sentries are squatting, smoking. We're ready to block the exits." A dry voice replied in his earpiece. Ali Soili's palace, the former residence of the French governor, loomed over the shore like a white ghost of colonial grandeur. The gates were guarded by 4 teenagers from the Youth Guard. They held old SKS carbines, and their berets were clearly too large for them. For professionals who had survived Indochina and Angola, this was no obstacle. Taking out the sentries took less than a minute. Not a single shot, only muffled blows and gasps. The mercenaries worked with the mechanical precision of surgeons. Inside the palace, it smelled of stale dust and cheap cologne. Denard led the way, Browning at the ready. He knew the building's layout by heart. He had once helped topple Ahmed Abdallah, the very man he was now flying back from exile in Paris. The cynicism of the situation did not bother him. Loyalty in the world of proxy wars was a commodity with a strictly limited shelf life. They found Soili in his second-floor bedroom. The dictator was not asleep. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in his underwear, a half-empty bottle of whiskey and an ashtray full of Gauloise stubs on the nightstand. Next to him lay a copy of Mao's Little Red Book. When the door burst open and masked men flooded the room, Soili didn't even flinch. He only slowly raised his head, and in his eyes Denard saw a strange mixture of relief and madness. "Bob?" Soili asked softly, recognizing the leader's silhouette. "I knew they would send you. The French don't know how to forgive gracefully." "It's not just the French, Ali." Denard lowered his pistol. "You've become too expensive for everyone to maintain. Moscow is far away, but we are here." Meanwhile, chaos erupted in the city. Group Bravo opened fire on the barracks when one of the waking pioneers tried to raise the alarm. The rattle of FNFAL bursts tore the night silence apart. Muzzle flashes painted the palms in a deathly green light. The boy soldiers, faced with the professional brutality of the White Devils, fled in panic, dropping their weapons. By 4 in the morning, it was over. Moroni's radio station was seized without a shot. A technician from Denard's group placed a record of a military march on the turntable, and then a pre-prepared script was broadcast, announcing the fall of the tyrant and the return of the legitimate president, Ahmed Abdallah. Soili was led into the palace's inner courtyard. The sky in the east was beginning to lighten, taking on a delicate pink hue that promised another scorching day. "What do we do with him, Chief?" one of the mercenaries asked, adjusting his rifle sling. Denard checked his watch. Langley and Paris were waiting for a result. A living Soili was a political problem. UN trials and endless accusations of human rights violations. A dead Soili was merely an unfortunate incident during a change of power. "Attempting to escape," Denard muttered curtly, turning away as he reached for a cigarette. A dry burst from a MAT-49 put an end to the history of Comorian socialism. The former president's body was left on the dusty tiles of the courtyard, next to blooming hibiscus bushes. 2 hours later, A private Falcon jet from Libreville touched down on the tarmac of Ihandra Airport. Out stepped Ahmed Abdallah, an elderly man in a sharp French suit and a fez. He squinted against the bright sun and the smell of gunpowder that had not yet cleared from the air. Denard met him at the ramp, saluting with the grip of his pistol. "Welcome back, Mr. President," the mercenary king said with a faint smirk. "Your guard is ready for service." Abdallah embraced Denard. He knew the price of that embrace. From now on, he was president in name only. Real power on the islands had passed into the hands of 50 white mercenaries, whose salaries were now to be paid directly from the Comoros' meager budget, supplemented by tranches from the CIA's black funds. At headquarters in Langley, the handler received a brief telegram over a secure channel. "Object Atlantis secured. Weather clear. The seller has returned to the shop." The operation was executed cleanly. To the rest of the world, it looked like an internal coup, a classic African pastime. No one asked how a handful of conspirators had acquired modern communications and precise intelligence. The archipelago was Western once more. The Indian Ocean was a little safer for tankers, and a little more dangerous for everyone else. Bob Denard stepped onto the balcony of the presidential palace. He looked out over the turquoise ocean and felt like the master of this land. He did not yet know that this victory would be the beginning of a 10-year reign, turning the Comoros into the strangest laboratory of the Cold War. The Mercenary Republic. Chapter 4. The Mercenary Republic. Moroni, Grande Comore, 1982 to 1985. By the early 80s, the Comoro Islands had transformed into the most surreal enclave of the Cold War. Officially, Ahmed Abdallah ruled the country, but everyone in Moroni knew the president did not leave his palace without the permission of the White Shadows. Bob Denard had officially taken the post of head of the Presidential Guard, Garde Presidentielle, but in reality, he had become the vice king of the archipelago. This was the golden age of black operations. The CIA and French intelligence had created an ideal hub on the islands, a gray zone where international law dissolved in the tropical humidity. While Washington publicly condemned the apartheid regime in South Africa, heavy Lockheed L-100 Hercules transport planes moved through Moroni Airport. They carried South African raw materials to Europe and returned with French weapons and electronics, bypassing every embargo. "It's just business, nothing personal," the handler used to say, flying in from Paris for inspections. He would sit on the veranda of the Galawa Hotel, sipping a gin and tonic. Opposite him, Denard, dressed in a pristine white safari suit, cleaned his fingernails with a small crop. In the port below them, crates marked medical supplies were being unloaded, though by their weight and the distinct metallic clank within, they clearly contained assault rifles. "The Southerners pay on time," Denard continued. "My boys train their special forces, and in return, Pretoria covers Abdallah's budget deficit. Plus, we've installed a powerful signals intelligence station atop Mount Carthala. Now we hear every breath the Soviet signals units take in the Indian Ocean, from the Seychelles to Mauritius." The Mercenary Republic became a state within a state. Denard created his own business empire under the name Sogicom. The mercenaries owned hotels, security firms, airlines, and even farms producing ylang-ylang. Yesterday's soldiers of fortune had turned into colonial barons. They smoked Monte Cristo cigars, drove armored Mercedes-Benzes, and kept local ministers waiting in their foyers. But behind this facade of luxury lay a cynical calculation. The KGB had no intention of simply surrendering the region. On the neighboring Seychelles, the Marxist Albert René had consolidated power, turning the islands into a chessboard. Langley demanded constant vigilance from Denard. "Containment isn't just a pretty word, Bob," the handler said. "We need the Comoros to remain an unsinkable aircraft carrier. If Abdallah starts showing independence, remind him who brought him back in that Falcon." Abdallah indeed began to chafe under the guardianship. The puppet dictator felt like a hostage in his own palace. Denard's guard, 500 strong, an elite unit trained to special forces standards, was the only real power in the country. The local army had been disarmed and turned into labor battalions. The atmosphere in Moroni grew increasingly paranoid. In the bars where the mercenaries gathered, conversations were held in low voices. Rumors circulated that the Soviet station in Antananarivo was preparing a counterstrike. Denard imposed a curfew and increased patrolling. Now his men carried not only rifles but modern encrypted radios provided by friends across the pond. Life on the islands resembled a prolonged party on the edge of a volcano. The mercenaries hosted lavish receptions where champagne flowed like water, while in the backyard, suspects linked to the opposition were being interrogated. Denard, who had converted to Islam and changed his name to Saeed Mustafa Majoub to appease the local clergy, carried himself like an absolute monarch. "You know what your problem is, Bob?" one of his old comrades asked him once, cleaning his Sig Sauer. "You've started to believe this fairy tale will never end. But we are just expendable assets for Langley. As soon as the wind changes, they'll forget our names." Denard merely blew a smoke ring toward the ocean. "I am the one who changes the wind," he replied. But by 1987, the geopolitical plates began to shift. Gorbachev in Moscow was talking about détente. Washington began to reevaluate its black operations, fearing scandals like Iran-Contra. South Africa, under the pressure of internal protests, became a less reliable partner. The mercenaries, who for 10 years had been the perfect tool, were suddenly becoming a liability. They knew too much, cost too much, and looked too odious against the backdrop of the New World agenda. In the corridors of the DGSE in Paris and the offices of Langley, the exit strategy was being discussed. The archipelago, once a safe harbor for the dogs of war, was turning into a trap. In the air, besides the scent of cloves, there was now the distinct smell of an approaching storm. Denard felt it in his skin, but he had grown too accustomed to his crown to simply take it off. Operation Atlantis was entering its final, bloodiest phase. Chapter 5. The Corsair's Sunset and the Echo of Coup. Moroni, Grande Comore, November 1989. A tropical downpour slammed into Moroni without warning, turning the dusty streets into torrents of orange mud. Inside the Beit as-Salam presidential palace, a heavy silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the corrugated iron roof. The Cold War was reaching its end. The Berlin Wall had already cracked, and the world Bob Denard knew was rapidly disintegrating. Ahmed Abdallah sat in his chair, aged and consumed by paranoia. Before him on the desk lay a decree to dismiss the Presidential Guard and disarm the mercenaries. It was a demand from Paris and Washington. The civilized world no longer required the services of the dogs of war. The handler from Langley no longer sent checks. He now sent cold directives regarding the necessity of a democratic transition. "You will not sign this, Ahmed." Denard's voice emerged from the shadows of the office. He looked exhausted. His once pristine safari suit was darkened by moisture. In his hands he held not a crop, but an Uzi submachine gun. "Bob, the times have changed," Abdallah whispered, his eyes never leaving the floor. "South Africa no longer provides funds. France threatens a blockade. My people, they hate your men. You have become a state within a state that is devouring itself." What happened in the following minute remains a mystery buried in the archives of intelligence services. The official version claimed a guard burst in and opened fire, and the president was killed in the ensuing crossfire. The unofficial version, Denard realized his time was up and decided to leave with a spectacular explosion. When the gunpowder smoke cleared in the stifling air of the office, Ahmed Abdallah was dead, and the mercenary king stood over his body, realizing he had committed his final, fatal coup. French special forces and Marines landed on the islands a few days later. It was a classic restoration of order operation sanctioned by the Élysée Palace. Yesterday's allies from the DGSE now looked at Denard through the sights of FAMAS rifles. "The game is over, Bob," a Marine colonel said, meeting Denard at the airport. "Your handlers in Langley have washed their hands of you. You are no longer an instrument of containment. You are an international criminal." Denard and 300 of his loyal affreux were deported to South Africa. The archipelago they had controlled for over a decade plunged into chaos. The departure of the mercenaries created a power vacuum that was immediately filled by new pretenders to the throne. Epilogue: The Archipelago of Instability. After 1989, the Comoro Islands became one of the most unstable places on the planet. Over the next 30 years, the country endured more than 20 coups and attempted seizures of power. Denard's shadow continued to haunt these shores. He returned in 1995 on a vintage inflatable raft with a handful of veterans, attempting to replicate the success of Operation Atlantis. But the era of retro-style Black Ops had finally vanished. Today, the Comoros is a quiet, impoverished corner of the Indian Ocean, where the ruins of mercenary-owned hotels are slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. In the bars of Moroni, one can still find old men who remember the White Guards and the scent of expensive cognac in the presidential palace. For the CIA and Western intelligence agencies, the Mercenary Archipelago remains in the textbooks as an example of an ideal, and ideally cynical, proxy war. They secured control over the ocean without losing a single official soldier. The price of this success, decades of chaos for a tiny island nation, was never included in the reports to Congress. The logic of the Cold War knew no morality. It knew only results. And in this chess match played on the azure surface of the ocean, the Comoro Islands were merely a pawn, sacrificed at the right moment to keep the queen on the board.